The hearing will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today on a very important issue, and we're pleased to have the testimony from very important witnesses on resisting anti-Semitism and xenophobia in Europe. And without objections, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. I'll now make a brief opening statement, then turn it over to the ranking member of the full committee for his opening statement. This week, the world again recognizes International Holocaust Remembrance Day, a day marking the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Together, we mourn the lives lost during the Holocaust and honor the stories of victims and survivors. Importantly, we also reaffirm our commitment to countering all forms of hate and intolerance. We're honored to be joined by Dr. Munzer, a Holocaust survivor. Anti-Semitism and hate is something we must work tirelessly to address in government and across civil society. But at its core, we can't forget the deeply personal nature of these harms. Thank you for taking the time to join us here today. It's important that you and Dr. Lipstadt are here to provide a personal and historical perspective on anti-Semitism in Europe and around the world. Nazism and fascism led to the state-sponsored persecution and mass murder of 6 million Jews, as well as millions of other innocent victims. It's essential to acknowledge that evil does indeed exist. Anti-Semitism and hate did not begin with Adolf Hitler, and it did not end after the Holocaust. Hate speech, discrimination, and violence based on a person's identity, be it creed, race, sexual orientation, place of origin, or otherwise, is a scourge we cannot afford to ignore at any time. It's also important to note that, given the focus of the subcommittee, our hearing today addresses these trends in Europe. However, we're seeing similar concerning trends, sadly, right here in the United States. One horrific attack occurred just at the end of last month in New York in a rabbi's home during a Hanukkah celebration. We've seen a concerning increase in anti-Semitism in Europe, with 28% of European Jews reporting they experienced anti-Semitic harassment at least once during the last year. We also know these incidents often go unreported, so we know the actual number is significantly higher than this. And as we know, hate and discrimination do not only affect European Jews. Reported cases of Islamophobia, they've also increased in every country in Europe. And a recent EU study found that 26% of LGBT people surveyed have been attacked or threatened with violence in the last 5 years. Jewish cemeteries have been violated with anti-Semitic symbols and fires that have been started near, and intentionally so, started near refugee camps. These numbers are staggering, and the stories of these violent actions are heartbreaking. Many of us familiar with the poem attributed to Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller, which has been transcribed in different ways, but it is engraved in the entrance of the New England Holocaust Museum in my home state of Massachusetts. Goes as follows. They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, no one was left to speak up. We must do more. This type of violence and hate is unacceptable if we want to call ourselves democratic societies. Reaffirming our commitment to addressing this isn't enough. As governments, we must act. We must do the difficult work of changing laws and policies, as well as the language we use, so that innocent people are not killed or harassed because of who they are. We must also meaningfully engage communities, civic leaders, and educators to bring about critical change at the grassroots level. That's why I'm so pleased to have our second panel joining us today. Our experts on that panel have decades of experience combating hate from governmental and non-governmental posts, and I look forward to discussing our current efforts and what we should do to do better. This is a critical time to work together with our partners and allies globally. We should share effective solutions, coordinate our efforts so that we're putting real action behind our rhetoric when we say, never again. Accordingly, I am introducing a resolution this week recognizing these concerning trends in Europe and calling on all countries to take action together to combat anti-Semitism and hate. I want to thank our witness for joining us today in this important issue. I now turn to the ranking member of the committee, Representative McCall.
I want to thank you, Chairman Keating, for your leadership, your passion on this issue, for calling this important hearing to examine the rise of anti-Semitism and xenophobia in Europe. As the son of a World War II veteran, D-Day veteran, a B-17 bombardier who bombed the Nazis 75 years ago to end their anti-Semitic regime, it saddens me today that we are still struggling with the same issues that the greatest generation defeated. I've toured Auschwitz and seen firsthand the horrors and evils that my father's generation fought to destroy. A recent report by the EU said that in Europe today, quote, anti-Semitism pervades everyday life. This is a tragedy. It's unacceptable. And Congress must lead the charge to addressing this scourge. This is an international issue, and it requires an international solution. Our first panel will remind us of the tragedy that can result if we do not speak out, as the chairman said, speak out and take this problem seriously. Al Munzer will share his story. And thank you, sir, for being here today. A very important story as a survivor of the Holocaust. And Deborah Lipstadt, one of the world's leading experts on the Holocaust, who herself has been victimized by anti-Semitic Holocaust denial, which astounds me that people could actually deny it happened. She will help explain the importance of ongoing Holocaust education. And for our second panel, we will turn to the present day. Our witnesses will examine the different strains of anti-Semitism in Europe that are combining to create an atmosphere where many Jews fear for their safety. Understanding the drivers of this hatred is essential to preventing its spread. I'm grateful to this administration for taking this fight seriously. I've met with their special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, Elon Carr, who told me about how he travels the world working with our partners to identify the best way to fight anti-Semitism in their countries. This is a problem in Europe. It's also a problem in the United States. And I hope our witnesses will offer concrete solutions for how Congress can help the administration succeed in fighting this anti-Semitism in Europe and the United States. This is not a partisan issue in such a partisan time. It's not Republican, Democrat, it's American. Back to our core values. And earlier this week, the House voted in an overwhelming bipartisan fashion to ensure funding for Holocaust education in our country. I think about my own children today. For them, it seems like ancient history. For me, it's one generation away. And it's one generation that it's not extinction, unfortunately, and it could happen again. And in the words we always say, never again. So we are leading by example, I think, in the United States with our commitment to understanding the poison of anti-Semitism, and now we must help others solidify their commitment to this fight. So thanks again, Mr. Chairman, for holding this, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for those words. I recognize for a brief statement, Vice Chair, Representative Spanberger.
Thank you to the committee for organizing this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for your participation. In advance of this hearing, I contacted rabbis and friends back home in Virginia. I wanted my questions to be centered in their thoughts and shared experiences, because as we talk about anti-Semitism in Europe, the deepest impact of anti-Semitism facing my constituents are the threats, the crimes, and the fear that exists in Virginia. I'm sure you've seen the images from 2017 when white nationalists walked through the streets of Charlottesville, a beautiful college town. Men with torches shouted, "Jews will not replace us." And just miles down the road in my district, our JCC summer camp was graffitied with anti-Semitic slurs. Our high schools and our little leagues have been graffitied with language of hate, and a plot to bomb synagogues and attack black churches was uncovered by the FBI a few years ago. Central Virginia has one of the oldest Jewish communities in the United States, dating back to the 1700s. And in the aftermath of a genocide that killed millions of Jews in Europe, we are a place where Holocaust survivors settled, raised families, and found some level of normalcy after escaping the unthinkable and losing everything. We have leaders in our community who share their stories of their escapes: the family that was warned by a professor, "Take your children and leave Germany," the woman who survived because a kind stranger gave her family false papers, and the man who spent months as a child living in a potato hole underground after escaping a deportation line. Central Virginians have advocated for education, seeing it as the way to avoid the very rise in anti-Semitism generations past had escaped. We have a deeply moving Holocaust museum to educate our children, active community synagogues, and even a regionally known Jewish food festival. And yet, as the generations of my parents and grandparents worked to root out anti-Semitism with community and education, today we are confronted with the stories of my generation and our children's. High school children in my district are told, "Take a shower," a dark reference to the gas chambers of concentration camps. Young mothers are fearful of having their children's religion known, and a rabbi who grew up with the incomprehensible knowledge that his great-grandparents and other family members had perished en route to a concentration camp now must contend with how to lead his family and his congregation when his own young children are taunted by strangers on the street when wearing a kippah in public. The response in Europe and here has been the fortification of Jewish spaces, but as another local rabbi noted, the doors of houses of worship should be open to all seekers without those inside needing fear, and it keeps me up at night. Not only the fear about whether I can keep my people safe, but also the sadness and frustration about who inevitably gets left out on the other side of the locked door. Thank you for your participation today. I yield back.
And thank you. Chair now recognizes Vice Chair Wagner.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the ranking member, Mr. McCall, for this hearing. And I want to thank and welcome all of our witnesses today as well. We're honored, of course, to be joined for this first panel by Dr. Alfred Munzer, and a survivor of the Holocaust, one of the most unimaginable tragedies in human history, and Dr. Lipstadt, who has fought for decades to end the phenomenon of Holocaust denialism. This Monday marked Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I was able to stand in solidarity with St. Louis's Jewish community, including 6 Holocaust survivors. And in a tribute to the 6 million victims of the Holocaust, the St. Louis Holocaust Museum and Learning Center announced its very first expansion in 25 years, made possible in part by a federal grant that we were able to work on with them from the National Endowment of Humanities. The Jewish community of St. Louis is working to ensure the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten and to give the next generation the tools to end genocide and atrocities. It grieves and shocks me that anti-Semitism is rising again in Europe, in the US, and in fact across the world. The United States and its European partners must be leaders in examining the root causes of this hateful ideology and ending its influence. We remember the millions of victims of genocide throughout history, and we commit to working toward the day when genocide and mass atrocities crimes are inconceivable. As decades pass and new strains of anti-Semitism emerge, the testimonies of survivors, liberators, and witnesses take on an even greater significance. So many in our community are stepping up to educate the next generation about the horrors of the Holocaust. And I believe we in Congress have the same responsibility. Genocide is preventable. We are very good in the US at response on genocide, but genocide is preventable. Anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination can be overcome. We are haunted by repeated failures and missed opportunities to end these tragedies before they begin. There is more the United States can do and must do to help vulnerable communities and persecuted people around the world. Dr. Munzer and Dr. Lipstadt, thank you for your courage and your dedication. Again, we are honored to have you here. I look forward to your testimonies and to the testimonies of our second panel of experts as well. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Let me introduce our first panel of witnesses. Dr. Alfred Munzer is a Holocaust survivor as well as a volunteer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We thank you for coming here and sharing your story and the story of your family. We thank you for your service to this country as a veteran who served the United States Air Force. Thank you, Doctor. Deborah Lipstadt is a Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies and the Department of Religion at Emory University. Dr. Lipstadt continues to study and publish on these issues today with a recent book entitled Anti-Semitism, Here and Now, a book that I've read myself. It's released just in the past year, and it looks at the history of concerning trends we're discussing today. I appreciate both of you for being here. Look forward to your testimony. We set a time of 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written materials will be made a part of the record. I'll now go to Dr. Munzer for your statement. Thank you, Doctor. The microphone, there you go.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I'm a survivor of the Holocaust and a volunteer of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts as you examine the frightening resurgence of anti-Semitism and xenophobia in Europe and elsewhere. I was born in the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, and I'm only able to appear before you because a Dutch-Indonesian family and their Indonesian Muslim nanny risked their lives to save a 9-month-old Jewish baby. Tole Madna, the Madna family, and Mima Sayina cared for me and protected me from the Nazis for 3 long years. They shared their meager food allowance with me because I did not legally exist and was not entitled to ration coupons. They made sure I did not ever come near a window for fear that passers-by might see a very different-looking child. I slept in Mima's bed, and she kept a knife under her pillow, vowing to kill any Nazi who might try to come and get me. But what I remember most is being surrounded by love and laughter. My sisters, Eva and Leah, did not share my good fortune. They had been entrusted to a different family, but were betrayed and denounced to the Nazis and killed in Auschwitz. They were 7 and 5, 2 of 1.5 million children killed in the Holocaust. My parents, too, were deported. My father was liberated 75 years ago by the 80th U.S. Army, but succumbed 2 months later to the effects of starvation and lies buried in the former Ebensee concentration camp. My mother survived 12 concentration camps, and I was reunited with her in August 1945. In 1958, she and I immigrated to the United States in the hope of leaving behind the painful memories of the Holocaust. I have remained in close touch with the Madna family. People asked Tole Madna why he risked the lives of his family to take in a Jewish baby. His response was simple: what else was I to do? The Holocaust deprived me of the guidance of a father and the companionship of 2 siblings. But worse, the solemn promise never again did not spell an end to anti-Semitism or to prejudice and hate directed to anyone perceived as being the other. I'm a physician, and the Holocaust has taught me that hate is a communicable disease that can engulf entire nations and continents. We may never eliminate hate from every human soul, but perhaps we can take measures to prevent its spread, like the fight against AIDS, the campaign against tuberculosis, and the drive to prevent malaria. A campaign against hate requires a global commitment that includes all segments of society, but especially those who occupy any kind of leadership position. There's a prayer on the monument of a mass grave in Ebensee that reads, "To the faithful companions, the heroes, and the comrades of 1,000 dead who rest here, and countless others of all nationalities and every faith, brothers and sisters in a common tragic destiny, dedicated by an Italian woman who prays that such incredible sacrifice might turn the human heart to good." Recent events around the world add urgency to the prayer of that Italian woman, and it falls to all of us to answer her plea, to confront hate, to prevent its spread, and to foster a world that celebrates our common humanity. I have 2 photographs with me, Mr. Chairman, which I would ask to be included in the record. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Lipstadt.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for having me, and more importantly, thank you for holding this hearing. Anti-Semitism is a prejudice, and as such, it is an irrational sentiment. It is not disliking a Jew, it is disliking someone because they are a Jew. The etymology of the word prejudice makes its irrationality quite clear. Prejudge. You decide on a person's qualities before you even meet them. It's unrelated to what the person does. To hate an entire group because of the behavior of one person or even a group of people makes no sense. While anti-Semitism is a prejudice, and as such shares many of the characteristics of prejudice in general, it has certain unique characteristics that set it apart from these hatreds. First of all, it is rooted in a conspiracy theory. As such, the Jew is not just to be loathed, but to be feared. We see this notion on the far right. According to the anti-Semite on the far right, the Jew is engaged in a conspiracy against others, a conspiracy designed to destroy white Christian culture by replacing whites with people of color. This is what motivated the murderer at Pittsburgh, San Diego, Halle. This is what the demonstrators in Charlottesville meant when they said Jews will not replace us. Secondly, anti-Semitism is unique because it comes from not just from the right, but also from the left. The anti-Semite on the left sees Jews as privileged, white, which of course is ironic. First of all, there are a substantial number of Jews who are not white. The estimate in the United States is 12% of the Jewish community is not white, and well over 50% of the Jewish Israelis would not be considered white. Finally, as mentioned, anti-Semites on the far right consider Jews to be decidedly non-Caucasian. Today, however, we see it not just from the right and the left, as been mentioned by some of the members of the committee. We see it from Islamist extremists, and particularly in Europe, in countries such as Belgium, France, Germany, even the UK, and amongst some sectors of the Muslim community, I emphasize some, of course not all, who, while not extremists, and may never engage in a violent action against Jews, have been inculcated with a hatred of Jews. Irrespective of whether these charges come from right, left, Christian, Muslims, or atheists, they rely on the same themes: the nefarious Jew manipulating the scene to his own and her own advantage. What then can we do about it? If it is irrational, must we simply throw up our hands in defeat? I think not, even though Jews may not present as typical victims of prejudice. In Halle, Germany, there was no police guard outside the synagogue on Yom Kippur because the mayor rejected the request. That's not taking it seriously. In 2017, Sarah Halimi, a retired 65-year-old physician mother of 3, was murdered in her apartment by a man who shouted Allah Akbar as he threw her out of the window. Just last month, in a shocking decision, one decried by President Macron, the Paris Court of Appeal decided that he was not criminally responsible because he was too high on marijuana to understand what he was doing. He understood enough to find the one Jewish resident of the building. He understood enough to declare that he had killed the Satan. He did not randomly go and kill people. He sought out the Jew, declaring him not responsible. That's not taking it seriously. The British Labour Party, exemplifying an attitude on the left, repeatedly dismisses the claims made by Jews that they have been subjected to anti-Semitism. Jeremy Corbyn may be gone, but those around him who exemplify this attitude remain. They don't take anti-Semitism seriously. One of the greatest results of anti-Semitism is Jews increasingly going underground. In the Netherlands, there is a town where if you want to know the time of synagogue, you have to know somebody. There's no listing for the times. There's no listing of the address of the synagogue. There's no website. That's fear. A few days ago, a professor here in Washington, a Jew, told me she had gone to Portugal with her husband on a vacation. She reached for an umbrella, did not take the umbrella with the logo of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia because it had a star on it. That's fear. Parents in Europe regularly tell their children not to wear their kippots, wear hats. That's fear. Friends have asked me whether my recent decision to wear a Jewish star is smart. That's fear. Jewish parents in New York, Berlin, Brussels are taking their children out of Jewish schools because they fear for their safety. That's fear. After the Shoah, it's inconceivable that once again Jews feel safer hiding their Jewish identity. This is not healthy for Jews or for the societies in which they live. We must fight anti-Semitism for these reasons. All genocide begins with words. No genocide ever began with actions. But there's an even more important reason. We must do so because anti-Semitism is a lethal threat to democracy. Wherever anti-Semitism has flourished, democracy has withered. Thank you very much.
I thank the witnesses. I'll recognize myself for just a couple of questions, I hope. Dr. Lipstadt stated that anti-Semitism is not something random. Dr. Munzer, you lost 2 sisters. You lost your father. And you were an innocent boy when this all began. If you could, if it's all right, could you share how, from the innocence of youth, you came to understand that these acts weren't random, that they were selected, they were targeted, and how did you come about understanding that, coming from the standpoint of that innocence to what you know today, and what was important to you in that journey?
Well, I grew up with the Holocaust all around me, so I really had very little understanding in terms of differentiating what was normal and not normal. I did not understand what happened to my sisters. People would tell me wonderful stories about them, and I grew up as a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, being a little bit jealous of my sisters. And then I overheard people saying, well, such and such a person came back, and that person did not come back. And I began to understand that my sisters had been taken somewhere and did not come back. I also remember the very first experience I had being exposed to anti-Semitism, and it wasn't long after the Holocaust. My mother and I were standing in line to go see a movie, and there was a man behind us who saw the tattoo, the Auschwitz tattoo, on my mother's arm, and he said, "There's one they didn't get." So even immediately after the Holocaust, there continued to be anti-Semitism in the Netherlands, and it's one of the reasons why ultimately we came to the United States.
Thank you so much. I remember as a young boy, one of my neighbors, the mother of 2 of my playmates. I didn't understand some of the symptoms that were traumatic stress, I view it now, that she was going through. And there was a tattoo that you just mentioned, similar to that, on her arm. And I didn't know what it meant and asked my parents, and we had a discussion where my parents tried to explain to me something that was hard to comprehend as a child. Thank you for sharing your story. Dr. Lipset, you said Holocaust deniers are wolves in sheep's clothing, spreading hate but attempting to present its rational discourse. The statement struck me, and in this sense too, the dissemination of this kind of thought, today it's aided by social networking, the internet, anonymity that surrounds that. Could you share with us some of the things we could do to try and counter that, given these new challenges?
It's very hard to control social media, as we all well know. When I started to work on Holocaust denial in the early 90s, writing my first book, which precipitated the lawsuit against me and the trial, if you wanted to receive Holocaust denial materials, you had to get them to a P.O. box, from a P.O. box, in a plain envelope. Today, all you have to do is put on the internet. Dr. Munzer comes from the Netherlands. If you Google Anne Frank's diary, depending what you put in particular, what's going on, but very often the second, third, and maybe not the second, the third or fourth thing that will come up, which will be a claim that it is a fraud, it was written after the war, et cetera. So it's very hard to control that. But I think the need for education is paramount. But it can't just be education, this is what happened to the Jews, because a kid who hears anti-Semitism at home or encounters it on the media is going to say, oh, they hated them too. It's got to be well thought out education about anti-Semitism, well thought out education about Holocaust education. I hope that, I'm very glad that this bill that you mentioned passed, but it's got to be thought out structurally very, very carefully.
Okay. Well, thank you. Chair recognizes Ranking Member McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Munzer, thank you for that powerful testimony. I can't imagine growing up as a child in that kind of environment. And having, as I mentioned, my father's generation, we thought it was destroyed. We thought it was over after the war. And now we're seeing this rise in anti-Semitism. How do you, I just find it hard to believe. And who would subscribe to being a neo-Nazi after seeing the horrors of what the Nazis did and the awful chapter in history that even people in Germany today are, I think from a conscience standpoint, feel guilty, and they should. But how do you account for this rise in anti-Semitism? That's for both of you.
We left the Netherlands in 1958 to escape anti-Semitism and to go to the New World. And we had, this is how we looked on the United States. A totally different world where people were free of hate. And then we turned on our television set. That was our first piece of furniture, actually. And we saw little black kids being beaten up because they wanted to go to a particular school. And we realized that America wasn't perfect either. But then, as we saw the unfolding of the civil rights movement, we also realized that America has the mechanisms to overcome tremendous difficulties, social difficulties, and problems. And so to this day, even now, even as we see a rise in anti-Semitism and acts of hate, I still remain optimistic that there are going to be ways to overcome this.
I appreciate your optimism. Dr. Lipstadt, how do you
I'm just reminded, speaking of optimism, that the definition of a Jewish optimist is someone who thinks things can't get any worse. So, a Jewish pessimist knows that they can, and a realist knows that they are. I think there are a number of reasons that they don't explain it all, but they help us understand. I'm not sure there are many more anti-Semites in the world today than there were 10, 15, 20 years ago. But I think what has happened is the moral guardrails that made it unacceptable to say certain things, to do certain things, are down. so that people feel freer to make these comments. I think that's one thing. And what happens is then you get particularly young people, or not so young people, drawing a swastika, even though they may not quite understand what it means. And as the museum, if you go to the Holocaust Museum, they have all sorts of evidence of people even draw it backwards. They don't know how to quite draw it, which is something they don't need to learn. But because now they know it gets people angry. They know it's an edgy thing to do. I think we live in a day and age of populism. I don't mean by that patriotism, populism. I'm right, you're wrong. And the people who are wrong are you look for the traditional enemy, the people who have long been hated. Remember, anti-Semitism is called the longest hatred for a reason. It's in the weeds, it's in the atmosphere, and it's so easy to pull up. And today we've been speaking about some of the extremists, certainly the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the examples I gave. But there's the dinner party anti-Semite, the person who says, oh, we just hired a new associate at our firm. He's Jewish, but he's very honest. You know, or as happened to me in my first job, a colleague took me out to coffee. I was teaching at the University of Washington in Seattle. He told me that when I was the first person at the university there, this goes back to the 70s, to ever teach Jewish studies, that when he had been on leave, when this whole process of establishing that position and hiring me had gone on, and he said, when I came back and I learned we had hired a New Yorker, a woman, and he paused, and then he said, and a Jew, I thought, oh my God, what have we done? And then I was sitting there, I didn't know what to do, and I kept, to my enduring shame, I didn't say anything. And he said, but Deborah, you're the best thing to ever happen to this department. You are terrific. So, you know, you take the negative and you turn it, you think you're turning it into a positive, but it's rooted there as well.
Just a quick question, I have limited time, but this Holocaust denial, I don't understand it. Because it's so real, and anybody that's been to Auschwitz and seen the horrors and the evil there, what is the motivation, and what do they seek to gain from rewriting history and covering this up?
It's very simple: anti-Semitism. For the denier to be right, who has to be wrong? The tens of thousands of documents, many of them in the archives here in the library here at the museum and other places, the National Archives, that lay out what was going to happen and what happened. Who else? The survivors, Dr. Munzer, all the other survivors who have given their testimony, the bystanders, the people who lived in the towns and the villages around the camps, who lived adjacent to the mass shooting sites, who saw the trains going and filled with people coming out empty. But thousands of historians would all have to be in on the hoax or have been duped. And finally, the perpetrators. Germany says we did it. There's been not one war crimes trial since the end of World War II where a perpetrator stood up and said it didn't happen. He may have said, I didn't do it, I couldn't help it, I was following orders, but never, and yet these people come along and say it. They are anti-Semites. They do not like it if Jews get sympathy, and they want to gin up anti-Semitism. So it's an irrational thing, just like anti-Semitism.
I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Yeah. Vice Chair Spanberger.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your compelling and very interesting testimony today. Thank you for your presence here. Dr. Munzer, I'd like to begin with you. You told very deeply personal and moving story of your family's experience, and I was wondering if you could comment on what you see as the particulars of the trends, the changes that we've witnessed here in the United States or in Europe over the past few years, as we are seeing noted in the data, an uptick in anti-Semitic attacks here and in Europe. What are the on-the-ground things that you've noticed that we should be reacting to, that we should be denouncing?
Well, one of the saddest things is that surveys have shown, for example, that many, many young kids today, or high school students, do not know what Auschwitz was and do not know anything about the Holocaust at all. And I think once you forget, then you also, the event, you also forget the lesson. And, you know, the Holocaust does teach us some very important lessons that we ought. My family paid a tremendous price, And I do not want that to go totally to waste. I really want people at least to learn the lessons of the Holocaust, what hate can do, that hate eventually can lead to mass murder. That's the key lesson, and that there are ways of avoiding that. Education, I think, is probably the very, very first thing that needs to happen.
Thank you. And Dr. Lipstadt, you mentioned that anti-Semitism rears its head on the right, it rears its head on the left, and there becomes a chasm between those two things. My question for you today is, could you comment on what you've seen in terms of the use of anti-Semitism as a dividing factor, as an othering factor, as a political motivator? And I would just note, even within the recent weeks, with all that's been happening on Capitol Hill, there's been gross anti-Semitic
That's right.
tropes used against many of our colleagues,
Coup and right.
conspiratorial and such. And could you please comment on how deeply, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what that is for a scholar, from a scholar's perspective like yours?
From on one hand, it's shocking, but it's not surprising. When there's tension in a society, it's so easy to fall back on the usual scapegoats, whether it's people of color, whether it's Jews. You fall back on a scapegoat that people will believe. There was a story told, it said that German Jews used to tell this joke during the 30s, that a Nazi came to a mass meeting, Nazi official, and he said, the Jews did this and the Jews did that, and with great vigor. And someone yelled out, and the bicycle riders. And he turned to, why the bicycle riders? And the person said, why the Jews? In other words, it's irrational. So if we look for a rational explanation, we won't find it. But it's so embedded, as are some other isms, but certainly this has this ancient history that when in New York State, my home state, when a man who may well have been schizophrenic, may well have had a mental illness, but when he wanted to do something, he took a machete, drove 32 miles to Muncie, and went after Jews. Something in him had been embedded. He didn't just go out on the street and start hitting people or cutting people up. He went to find Jews. This man who threw Sarah Halimi, the doctor, out of the window in Paris, went to find the one Jewish resident. If it's in the society, we've got to address it. I want to echo what Dr. Munzer said in terms of education, but I, again, want to stress that it's got to be well thought out. It can't be simplistic. It can't be, this is just bad. It can't be an hour or 2 hours at the Holocaust Museum, however important that is. That won't do it. We've got to think it out. We've got to give teachers the training mechanisms. How do you address this so the students get it, especially those students who may be hearing it at home, or now they don't even have to hear it at home, encountering it on the internet?
I yield back.
Representative Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all so much for being here. I come from Knoxville, Tennessee, and my daddy, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Daddy enlisted United States Marine Corps and did his service over there, and was on a couple islands. One was Peleliu, and the other island was Okinawa. And after the war, he went to China and fought the communists. But my mama, she lost her brother Roy fighting the Nazis in the hedgerows shortly after D-Day. He was too old to go. He enlisted. He was heavily educated, and he came home. They sent him home, and they needed bodies, and he went back. And of course, he died, I believe, 15 days after the invasion. To the day I died, when they played the national anthem, my mama would always tear up. I knew she was thinking about her brother Roy. And with that, I was fortunate enough to be in the state senate in Tennessee with now Congressman Cohen, but he was a state senator then, and I was a state senator. And he chaired the Holocaust Commission, and he knew my love of the Jewish folks, and he put me on the Holocaust Commission. And I came up with the idea of actually building a Holocaust memorial in West Knoxville, in Knoxville, Tennessee. And we built that, and I'll never forget my parents. They're both in heaven now, but they were in their 80s, and I was laying sod out one day, and my friend Bernie Bernstein, who's a very prominent lawyer in town, had given us the words that they put on the stone. And I remember this lady came up and said, I said, "What are y'all doing here?" And she was not from from there. I could tell by her accent. And my mama said, see, Mama was in her 80s, and she was about 5 foot nothing. And she said, well, we're building a memorial. And she said, and the lady said, who's the memorial to? And she said, the Jewish folks that died in the Holocaust. And that woman, I'll never forget, said, we got enough monuments in this town. And my mom, all 5 foot nothing of her, stood up, dusted herself off, looked at this woman right in the face and said, not in this park, we don't, ma'am. That lady moved on. My parents were very good people. They were righteous people, and I appreciate what y'all are doing here, and I appreciate we need to let our young folks know that it's not just some black and white thing on the History Channel, and that 6 million people were murdered. And I hear all this political correctness that they were eliminated. No, they were murdered. They were murdered, and that word needs to be used every time. And I thank y'all so much, and I appreciate your passion. I have a lot of passion about that myself. I was fortunate enough to go visit Israel this year, and I only wish my folks could have been able to do that. That would have been something for them. And with that, I just had one question, ma'am, maybe sir, maybe both of y'all want to try to answer this. Which specific European countries are you particularly concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism? You know, I've heard France, I read the news, but you don't know what's getting filtered and what isn't. And I was just curious what you all think. And sorry about my long talk. I
That's all
cut
right.
off all the time.
I don't know how you feel about cloning, but I'd love to clone your mama.
Yes, ma'am. She was a wonderful woman. How would if I could
Use
have her
more
back for
people
1
like
minute?
that, irrespective of their height.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm going to answer your question and not answer your question. Virtually all of them. France is in a very, very difficult situation. And we've seen that, and we've seen it repeatedly, and President Macron has talked about it, as have other French officials. In Brussels, I was speaking to a woman who's a member of the Belgian parliament, and she told me that she had asked her two teenage children not to wear their Jewish star, and she said, I was embarrassed to ask them and glad when they agreed to put it under their shirt.
Was this homegrown? Do you think it's homegrown, or is it imported, or is it through the internet?
Some of it is homegrown. Some of it is coming from recent arrivals, particularly from Muslim countries, and some of it is coming from, increasingly from the right. Halle was from the right. Halle, Germany, the attack on Yom Kippur was from a rightist. Some of it is coming from Muslims, and this is acknowledged. I'm part of a Muslim-Jewish dialogue advisory group, and we talk about it. There has been an inculcation, sometimes from imams, sometimes from YouTube, sometimes from newspapers, of antipathy towards Jews. So this may be someone who'll never take a machete, never take a bomb, but who sees a Jew on the street and knocks off the yarmulke. And there's the story of what happened in Berlin about a year and a half ago of an Israeli Arab who lived in Berlin, who had gone back to Haifa for a visit, and one of his Jewish friends gave him a kippah, gave him a yarmulke, and said, but don't wear it in Berlin because you'll get beaten up. And this young Arab couldn't believe that, so he decided to test it. And he wore it in the streets of Berlin, and he was attacked, and because he speaks Arabic, he's a native Arabic speaker, he understood that the person attacking him was someone who spoke with Arabic with a heavy Syrian accent, and beat him up. So, you don't have to be Jewish, but so I can't single out one country. Each one has its problems, and the president of Germany just said, we haven't addressed it. In Germany, you have it, again, from the left, often expressed as an antipathy, a hatred of Israel, and you have it from the right, Halle, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, and others.
Well, thank you. I've run over my time, but if you ever catch me in the hall, I'll show you a cool picture of my mama. She flew an airplane during the war.
My God.
I've bored Miss Bamberger with this story many times, but I'm very proud of my mom and daddy. They were wonderful people. Thank y'all so much for being here.
Thank you for sharing that, Representative. Representative Weil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member of this subcommittee for holding this very important session. And thank you, Dr. Munzer and Dr. Lipstadt, for what you've said. I am the proud mother of 2 Jewish young adults. They were raised in a very safe and inclusive community in my district in Pennsylvania, perhaps so safe and inclusive that as a young mother, I was able to pretend that the specter of anti-Semitism would never affect them. Frankly, when their father and I made the decision to raise them in the Jewish faith, anti-Semitism was the furthest thing from my mind, even though their father had told me many stories of his own youth and encountering anti-Semitism in his childhood. But I thought we had moved beyond that. I was a young and perhaps naive mother. The Holocaust was a distant part of history in my mind. And in fact, I became a Jew by choice in solidarity with my husband and my children, and have never regretted it for a moment and would do it all over again. But as I've passed through middle age and regrettably have probably gotten to the other side of middle age, I find that I constantly am in fear for my children and for other young Jews as they travel around the world particularly, but of course here in the United States as well. I'm happy to say that my children are avid travelers. Their passports have far more stamps from different countries than mine ever did at that age. But I worry about them constantly and have found myself occasionally thinking about whether I should counsel them about what to say if they're ever asked if they're Jewish. I have not done so, and they have seen me proudly wear my Star of David. When I was running for Congress, I was counseled by a well-meaning local political activist that perhaps I should not wear my Star of David in my community, which it has a very small number of Jews. I took that as a challenge and instead went out and bought a larger one, which I wear every single day. Having said that, you know, I do believe that the only way to fight anti-Semitism is to confront it, to talk about it, to educate others, to tell the stories. Dr. Munzer, your story is one that I will never forget. And the story of the family, the Indonesian family that raised you, I think, causes all of us to want to be braver and more vocal and do more than we've done. So with all of that said, and I'm sorry that I've taken so much time, but I felt that it was important to tell you that, I come back to your remarks, Dr. Lipstadt, that education is a good thing, but we need to do it in a very well thought out way. And I'd like you to elaborate a little on that. As a member also of the Education and Labor Committee, I spend a lot of time thinking about what we do in our schools. What do we need to do to educate better on this subject?
First of all, the reason that I said Holocaust education is very important, but it's not a silver bullet, because if done even in a well-meaning way, well-intentioned, a child can walk away and say, well, the Nazis didn't like the Jews either. I mean, you see that with other study of other isms. They didn't like them. I have good reason not to like them. I think there has to be an understanding of the history of anti-Semitism, of the way its ubiquitous nature, starting in medieval Christianity, moving out of the church to Karl Marx, who hated all religions, to the pseudoscience of eugenics, to the Nazis, how it migrates, how it makes no sense. The anti-Semite charges, Jews are revolutionaries, they're all communists. Jews are Rothschilds and Soros, and last time I checked, you can't be a communist and a Rothschild at the same time. Jews are pushy, they're always trying to get into places where they're not wanted. Jews are clannish, they stick together. Last time I checked, you can't be all those things. That it's irrational. So that the way of doing it can't be just, this is a horrible thing that happened, but the bigger meaning, how it started. The Holocaust would have been impossible, and Dr. Munzer knows this, he's volunteered at the museum. The Holocaust would have been impossible without the help of hundreds of thousands of people. Many of those people active helpers, but many of them just looked the other way. And as the late Elie Wiesel said, and many others have said, when it comes to evil, There's no bystander. If you walk out of a building, you see somebody being beaten up and you don't do anything, maybe you can't intervene. There's 3 of them and there's 1 of you, but you don't call for help or something. You're not neutral. You've sided with the oppressor.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, my time is up, but I very much appreciate what you've said.
Thank you, Representative. We're out of order because Representative Pence has yielded and Cicilline, but I just, Representative Deutsch chairs the Ethics Committee, and so the other members have let him go forward. So I thank those members and recognize Representative Deutsch.
Thanks very much, Chairman Keating, and thank you very much to our witnesses for being here. I had the honor last week of joining with leaders, a delegation led by Speaker Pelosi and leaders from nearly 50 countries at Yad Vashem to mark 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz. And then we stopped at Auschwitz-Birkenau on our way there. And the question that I have for both of you in light of the conversation that we're having here is, while it was moving to be in a room with all of these world leaders pledging, remembering the Holocaust and pledging to fight anti-Semitism, it's hard not to feel like it's a distinct moment in time, and everyone goes back to everything that they're doing and doesn't think so much about this until the next act of violence anywhere in the world. And I guess that, Dr. Lipstadt, the question I have for you is, how do we get to a point where there is no tolerance for any act of anti-Semitism? How do we drive home the point that you've made eloquently, and lots of us try to make, that if there's anti-Semitism in your country, it's your country's core that's really at risk. Right. How do we do that?
There's no easy answer. First of all, I think you sit on this committee, the subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I think we have to call out leaders of other nations who engage in anti-Semitism, whether directly, overtly, or not, even if they are our friends. If they try to rewrite history, we see an attempt to rewrite history in Poland. We see an attempt to rewrite history in Hungary and Lithuania and other places, in Russia and about the Soviet Unions. I think we have to call them out. And then at the other end of the spectrum, not in terms of heads of state and governments, we all have to become the unwelcome guest at the dinner party. If someone says something, to paraphrase our friends at the TSA at the airport, if you hear something, say something. If someone makes a crack, you can't let it just go by. You may not change the mind of the person who made the crack, who said this anti-Semitic kind of, oh, I'm just joking, or whatever, or racist, or whatever it might be. But you've got to telegraph the message to the other people at the table, especially but not only the young people, that this is not acceptable. And so I think that that's another extremely important thing. And the final point, and with this I'll stop, is we also have to understand, or other groups, this is not a Jewish problem. Rape is not a women's problem. You want to stop rape, ask the rapist. You want to stop anti-Semitism, ask the anti-Semite. But a few weeks ago, I went up to New York to participate in the march and the rally. And as we walked across the Brooklyn Bridge, I found myself walking, and I get verklempt, to use the Saturday Night Live term, not a Yiddish term, next to a woman carrying a sign, "This Catholic hates anti-Semitism." And I thanked her for being there, and she said, "Oh no, don't thank me, it's our problem."
And she's right. And for every opportunity that we have to hear powerful survivors like Dr. Munzer for every opportunity that we have to hear that, there are 100 or 1,000 people on social media right now
That's right.
posting things that there can be that no one should be able to defend. And I guess I would finish with this question. As we spend our time thinking about the role that technology companies have here, you can't hide behind a claim that we're just putting the information out there when the purpose of your company is a for-profit venture, and in fact you're profiting by anti-Semitism that gets rebroadcast over and over and over again. Can you?
Not at all. You had testifying here in Congress, I don't know what committee, but the head of one of those companies who was proudly raising his children as Jews, saying that when it comes to Holocaust denial, we're not going to stop it. We're just going to be neutral because everybody has a right to their ideas. The social media, and this is beyond my expertise, but social media platforms need to take some responsibility, and maybe we need to have the urging of governmental leaders. When it comes to hatred, there's no neutrality. Whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's racism, whether it's homophobia, whether it's hatred of Muslims, whatever, there is no neutrality when it is hatred.
Right. Everyone, Mr. Chairman, if I may, it is an accurate point to say that everyone has the right to have whatever views they hold.
Absolutely.
That said, if anyone in this room were starting a business right now, and part of the decision at the outset of that new venture was to decide whether there should be some part of it devoted to the espousing of hatred and racism and anti-Semitism, everyone here would say, nope, that cannot be a part of what we're doing, and it shouldn't be a part, and it shouldn't be tolerated. And I agree with you that it will continue until, I am afraid, until this Congress acts to stop it. And I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Pence.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, for bringing together this hearing, and thank you, Dr. Munzer and Dr. Lipstadt, for being here. I'm a Catholic who hates anti-Semitism. It's part of the Pence family business, by the way, okay? I'm going to go off something that Dr. Lipstadt said, but Dr. Munzer, maybe you can weigh in on this one too. We're talking about education and the place. Let me ask you where higher education was in educating anti-Semitism in this country and where it is today.
We see a real problem on many campuses. Not all campuses, not every campus is a hotbed of anti-Semitism, but what we've seen on campuses primarily, the way it expresses itself there, is an antipathy towards Israel. And I'm not talking about criticism of Israeli policies. No intelligent person would think that criticism of Israeli policies constitutes anti-Semitism. You want to read criticism of Israeli policies, read Haaretz, or go to the Knesset, you'll hear criticism of the policies. But it's holding Israel to a different standard. It's attributing Israel's successes or achievements to anti-Semitic, well, they control the media, they control the press, they don't allow any criticism. It's a hatred that is not for everyone, but often has anti-Semitism at its core. And that's become a real problem on campus. Emory, which is my university, I've been there many years, is essentially a fairly apolitical campus. And the Jewish students who wear kippot or openly identify have had terrific experiences, but in this past year, they've begun to hear anti-Semitic cracks, to see those kind of things. And the people who do that, they're not the faculty, but the students feel they've gotten permission to say that.
Where did that permission come
Well,
from?
sometimes it will come from a faculty member, and sometimes it will come from the larger society, that this kind of thing is okay. It's the moral guardrails that I was talking about, and the moral guardrails are down, and I can make that kind of crack. It is very disturbing, and I think it needs to be seriously addressed. You also have another problem on certain campuses, and there are thousands of campuses in the United States. There are people who are in charge of diversity programs, provosts, or whatever, or just the people in the administration who don't get it. And I'm not saying that they're doing this nefariously, but it's hard for them to grasp that a Jewish student who looks privileged, who may not be privileged, but looks to them as white, looks to them as, comes from a stable home, has advantages. When they come in and say, I've been subjected to an anti-Semitic barrage or an anti-Semitic crack by a student in my dorm or whatever it is, it's often hard for them to grasp that this person is the object of prejudice, because their view of the person who's going to be the object of prejudice does not look like this person. And I am very careful about making analogies to the Holocaust. Today is not the 1930s. When I was once at the Holocaust Museum, a survivor told me the story of Kristallnacht, November 1938. He went to a Jewish school, a boarding school, because the school in his town he couldn't go to anymore. It was all the teachers were Nazis, and he was getting terrible treatment. So his parents sent him to a boarding school, a Jewish boarding school in a larger town. November 38, the synagogue next door, next to the school, is burning. The teachers come in and yell, "Get out, get out." And these little kids, 9, 10, 11 years old, go running out in their pajamas, and they say to one another, "Well, where should we go?" And one of them says, like Mrs. Rogers told her son Fred, find the helpers. They said, "We're going to go to the policeman." So they ran up to the policeman, and he looked at them and sneered and said, "I don't take care of Jewish children," and sent them away. And finally, they found some Jews on the street to help them. Today's not that day. Today I'm sitting here in the Congress of the United States with Dr. Munzer, a survivor of the Holocaust, giving testimony about anti-Semitism. We hear it being addressed seriously from so many different quarters. So today is not that day, but there are enough forces on the right and on the left who have given it quarter that it shouldn't have.
Can Dr. Munzer answer that question, please?
Doctor.
By the same token, talking about education, through the Holocaust Museum, I've had the opportunity to speak to dozens or hundreds of groups by now of high school students, and I'm absolutely struck, how receptive they are to the message, to learning the history of the Holocaust and learning the lessons. Last year, I was in a small town in Arkansas, Morrilton, Arkansas, and I spoke to several thousand students over several days, and I really wasn't sure whether they would get the message. And then, first of all, they asked some wonderful questions, even though this was a huge group. It was well organized. And then I got a stack of letters, which very much made it clear that they got the message. One of them was very simple. They said, we had a bullying problem in our school, and now, thanks to you, it's much better.
Thank you.
Representative Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for calling this a really important hearing, and it's a great honor to hear both from Dr. Munzer and Dr. Lipstadt, and thank you for being here. Dr. Munzer, thank you for sharing your story, and I think it is incredibly important that people all over the world continue to hear directly from Holocaust survivors and those who have been impacted by anti-Semitism today. We know that today's children are the last generation who will have the opportunity to see and hear for themselves directly from survivors, and it's our responsibility as a result to be certain that we keep your voice alive and the voices of other survivors to share your story, and most importantly for all of us to absorb the lessons of the Holocaust so that we can work together to prevent future instances of hate and bigotry and devastating brutality. But I think as your testimony, both of your testimonies reveal, this is a scary time for Jews all over the world. And despite my Italian last name, I'm Jewish. And I think we've seen the rise of neo-Nazis and white supremacist movements partly being fueled by the ability to communicate online and a rise in anti-Semitic attacks in the United States and around the world, and of course, particularly in Europe. And what I'm particularly interested in, Dr. Lipstadt, we have what was a Holocaust museum in Rhode Island, and we changed it into a Holocaust education center because we recognized that part of the importance of teaching the lessons of the Holocaust was to make sure people understood the history and the horrific murder of millions of Jews and others, but also to learn of the current dangers of bigotry and hatred and intolerance. And so it became really an education center, and we have in Rhode Island, I'm proud to say, mandatory Holocaust education in the public schools. So I'm curious to know what other kind of educational lessons we should learn to make education about the Holocaust useful in terms of not only teaching people history, but making sure we don't repeat it, and whether or not there are examples that you think we should look to and what role Congress might play in promoting that kind of education to prevent a future example of that kind of...
I think we just heard an example from Dr. Munzer, his experience in this small town in Arkansas. When someone can speak in the first person singular, this is my story, this is what happened to me, it has a tremendous impact. Sometimes I'm in residence at the Holocaust Museum this year as a senior research fellow, and sometimes when I walk through the lobby, there's a desk, talk to a survivor, and you're often sitting there. And I stand in a little off in a corner, but I watch young people of all colors, all faiths, all ages, but middle school, high school, hanging on every word that is being said. And when I bring a survivor to my class, when I first started teaching, I would decide, did I want a survivor who was in a camp? Did I want a survivor who was hiding? Now I just want someone who's vigorous enough to be able to come and speak. So that first person singular is so important. I have cousins who grew up in Cincinnati, which was even Ohio was still a southern town, and they're about 15 years older than I am. My mother came from a large family, and they grew up knowing one of the people who worked for their father had been born a slave on a plantation. And so they grew up knowing his story, and 15 years older than I am, slavery has a different resonance because they've heard the first person singular. I wish all survivors, as we say in Jewish tradition, 120 years, the lifespan of Moses, but soon that'll go away. And I think what the museum is doing and the education program there is something, as you begin to craft these educational programs, as you give advice, to different, whether it's on the state level or the national level, that those lessons, it's not a simple thing, just bring them to the Holocaust Museum. Right. It's got to be more than that.
The other question I have is, I think one of the other challenges we face is the ability to quickly and in a very profound way disseminate false information over the internet and the use of social media, which compounds, I think, this rise in anti-Semitism, because it's just easier to transmit false hate speech and information to millions and millions of people with a stroke of, one stroke of a keyboard. And I'm wondering what you see. I'm in the midst of an antitrust investigation of the big, large technology platforms, and they have enormous market power. But their failure to, in any meaningful way, curate what gets put on a platform and shared broadly, and in fact, some of the most contentious hate speech engenders the biggest reaction from consumers on the internet. Do you think that these platforms have a greater responsibility to manage or curate particularly hate speech, which is on these platforms and being disseminated widely, contributing significantly, in my view, to the rise of anti-Semitism?
Yes. Very simply, they have a big responsibility. They have a power. Look, I'm bringing coals to Newcastle telling you this. You know this from your work far better than I. They have a tremendous responsibility when it comes to hate, irrespective of who the object of the hate is. There's no neutrality. There's no neutrality. And to say, well, we're just a platform and anything goes, it's not, this is not an issue of freedom of speech. Everyone has the right to, as the Brits say, make an arse of themselves. But this is much more than that. This is engendering, inculcating, and it has a snowball effect, a tremendous snowball effect.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you first for your testimony. It is tremendously important to hear from you, Dr. Musner, your life story, Dr. Lipstadt, your understanding and the ability to articulate the truth of what's taking place and the hurt that hate causes, that anti-Semitism causes. I've been sitting here and listening and looking and watching the audience, especially Dr. Musner, as you gave your testimony. I could see the hurt in most of and just about everybody in the audience. And for me, Dr. Lipstadt, you said that hatred is a threat to democracy. Well, I agree with that, but I think it's more than that. I think hate is a threat to humanity, to all of us. Because that's what this is. It affects each and every individual, no matter where you come from, no matter what your religious belief, no matter what your ethnicity is. And we've got to say something about it. I'm a firm believer and follower. You talked about the civil rights movement and Dr. King and a number of his quotes and words, and he says, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Anti-Semitism, hatred, it matters. And we've got to stand up and speak out about it. And for me, I wanted to cancel other meetings that I had because I thought I had to be here. Because one of the things that I know as an African American, and given the history that you talked about here, one of the things I wanted to make sure, and when we are talking about civil rights and other issues, I think it is necessary for people who don't look like me to be on these microphones talking about it or to be in the audience. So this should not be a situation where it is just individuals of Jewish heritage. It's got to be something where all of us are involved and all of us stand up. It just seems to me the trouble that we're having today in the world, whether we're talking about Europe or the United States, we're thinking that certain speech you talked about freedom of speech. Well, to me, the day that hate speech becomes acceptable, freedom of speech ends. Because that's a danger to all of us. And so we've got to stand up and speak out about it. Dr. King also said, people are not going to remember the actions of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So we've got to stand up. I think I have an obligation. Wherever I see or hear or the opportunity to talk about fighting anti-Semitism, I've got to make sure, but not only in places like this, because you're right. If I'm at a local meeting and I hear somebody that utters something that's anti-Semitic, I have an obligation to say, that's not appropriate. You can't do that. That's hate. I know when I talk about racism, I want the same thing, and that's what this is all about. And I'm concerned, I liked your optimism. I think that I'm optimistic also. I think that this is the United States we've been able to overcome a lot, and we still got a lot to overcome, but we'll do that. But I do get concerned when I look at Europe and I look at the United States, and when I see governments accepting and or even to some degree running on anti-Semitic, it's do it in ways that they try not to be pronounced, but everyone understands those little things, whether you're a member of Congress, whether you're a member of a parliament someplace else, those things that we've got to make sure that we stand up and talk about. So I guess I'm almost out of time, but I just feel passionate and concerned. We just marched over the bridge together, over the Brooklyn Bridge, walking together with my friend Michael Miller in New York. I felt honored to be there and honored to see the number of good people there, because I truly believe when good people are talking loudly, I don't think that necessarily we're going to be able to, in one phrase, to end folks who have hatred in their heart, but I do want to silence them. I don't want them to feel that they can be free to talk and say anti-Semitic remarks and not going to be scolded about it.
You know, we live in a day and age where haters have been emboldened. And from your remarks, I would say we have to embolden the good people.
That's exactly right. So again, just want to thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for conducting this hearing and having it and keeping it focused, because we can never sit back and take it easy and take things for granted. Because if we do, we allow history to repeat itself. And that's one thing that I think that we all have an obligation, is to make sure the ugly part of history does not have the opportunity to repeat itself. And as soon as we see it, we've got to stamp it out, and by you doing this hearing, we're trying to stamp it out. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you for your words. Representative Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank those witnesses to testify today, Dr. Lipstadt and Dr. Munzer. Your testimony, I think, is as relative today as it was 75 years ago, as we recognize the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Monday, I was honored to participate at the United Nations on that anniversary with the Secretary General and ambassadors of Israel and Germany and other UN nations to recount what took place 75 years ago. And I'm not sure that my comments will add anything to what has already been discussed, except that I think, Dr. Lipstadt, you, I think for all of us, pointed out what is clear and evident, that anti-Semitism at its very root is hate. And hate, sadly, has been a part of man's history from the very beginning. I'm hesitant to say it's a part of nature, our human nature, but it seems to have been a pattern, certainly. I note that you know, what took place during the Holocaust was predated by the Armenian genocide, the first genocide in the 20th century, which was predated by horrific acts in the 19th and the 18th century. And you can go back, I'm a student of U.S. and world history, but to the Inquisition. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, in his comments marked about the own dark history in Portugal, when some of the most important members of the community who were Jewish were asked to either to leave during that Inquisition, that time period with Spain. They were rivals, but they had to live together, sort of, or to convert, which some of them did. My family's a reflection of that. We're Marrano. Or to go underground. And the Jews in Portugal did all of the above. Some left, some converted, and some went underground. But it gets back to hate. And I've got a fellow who's a professor who, in my office, who's got a very interesting book that he's wrote last year called Hitler's American Friends, the Third Reich Supporters of the United States during the 1930s. Interesting, prominent people in America in the 1930s. People who had investments in Nazi Germany. And the story that you told Dr. Munzer about your own personal experience. I had a dear friend whose mother was Dutch, and she wrote an interesting short story about the bicycle paths. These Dutch women who would ferry Jewish babies, and as the Nazi soldiers would pull them aside as they were off their bicycle with the little baby, they would, with guns pointed, urge them to demonstrate that that was their child by seeing whether or not those women could nurse the child. Part of your story, Dr. Munzer. And so I think when we talk about all of these points in history that go back thousands of years, it gets back to hate. How do we combat hate? Dr. King said, you know, hate can only be overcome by love, to paraphrase him. We've got to figure out a better way to deal with it. Or in that great play in South Pacific, you've got to be taught very carefully to hate. And sadly, history has indicated time and time again we're very good at teaching hate. You can see that in the 5,000 or more radicals that left Europe to join ISA in the last 2 years to be a part of that hate. So we must combine all of our collective resources, I believe, Mr. Chairman, and the efforts of this subcommittee and the efforts of those of you who have been so engaged to try to do in every possible way to overcome that hate. Thank you very much, and I've exceeded my time.
Representative Trone.
Thank you, Chairman. This is certainly the hate that Congressman Costa speaks about. It's touched, you know, so many people across the world now. And I mean, members of this panel ourselves, my oldest daughter received her Hebrew name at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where we had the atrocity. And, you know, so we've kind of worked to make it a point that everybody has got to, you know, hear these stories as long as they possibly can. And the work you're doing, Dr. Munzer, is just, you know, so important for so many people as we, you know, move forward and try not to ever let it slip away. Our staff is going to be at the museum on Monday, and they're going to be touring there just so we all make sure we have a direct appreciation. Your story is such a powerful one, and then again, the story of an immigrant that reached the top of your profession. Another powerful story that speaks to the diversity and how awesome it is for America to create the country that we have. But, you know, as you testified, those personal interactions with the visitors to the Holocaust Museum are so important to really understand the horrors of what took place. Does anybody in Europe at different museums, and I've visited a number throughout Europe, do they have anything where folks are there to share those personal stories and have an opportunity for, you know, for personal interaction?
I'm not sure.
Yes, there are a number of museums. Certainly in England, the Holocaust Educational Trust, and England is now building a memorial which will have an educational program. There is Memorial de la Shoah in France, in Paris. There are other examples. Nothing of the significance, I think, in the gravitas that you have of the Holocaust Museum, located, a few steps from the National Mall, located within sight. I look out my window, I can see the Jefferson Memorial, I can see the Washington Monument. But there are places, and they need support. The Holocaust, the Auschwitz Museum needs support. It's being pressured by the government, to sort of shift the story a little by the Polish government. There are places, but I think, again, as Dr. Munzer has so exemplified, that ability to hear the story told in the first person singular. No professor, however scintillating they may be and however compelling they may be, can match that first person singular.
Agreed. As we look at extremist anti-Semitic rhetoric, it's entering everywhere in Europe, particularly mainstream politics. What can a civil society and other elected officials like ourselves or national organizations, what can we do to help hold our public officials accountable for this rhetoric?
Well, one of the programs that I was involved with and exposed to was a few years ago was a State Department-run program that brings students from overseas to the United States to learn what it is to live in a multi-faith society. The specific experience I had was with a group of students from Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world. These students had never met anyone who was Jewish. They had been exposed to a lot of anti-Semitism, actually. And I told them my life story with photographs. And at the very end, I said, one memory I have of Mima Saina, the nanny who took care of me, is that she used to sing a lullaby to me. And it was called Nina Bobo in Indonesian. And the entire group of about 40 students started singing it in unison. And after that, these students embraced me, hugged me, and said, we are family. I retell that story very frequently because I think that's the ultimate message, is to get across the idea that we are all part of one human family.
No, I think that's absolutely crucial. I have about 6 mosques in my district, and I speak to them on a Friday afternoon after prayers, and we always talk about the fact that they're now being singled out in a lot of ways also, and this is all part of continuing of hate crimes, and they need to hear that we're with them, and after the incident in Pittsburgh, they came to our temple and they were with us, and that example is just so crucial that we all stand together. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Representative Frankel is not a member of the committee, heard about this hearing and rearranged her whole schedule today and has joined us, and certainly always welcome here. Representative Frankel.
And thank you for allowing me to participate, and thank you to our speakers today. Honored to have you here. I'm going to ask all my questions at once, and if you're able to answer, I hope you do. Number one is, could you assess the European government's response to the rise in anti-Semitism? Are they sharing data with each other? Is this being addressed at the EU level? And what, if anything, can the United States government do in this regard? There we go.
Well, let me say that you're going to have witnesses who follow us who probably are much...
Okay, well, I'm happy to, I'm going to, actually, just to let you know, I'm going to step out for a quick meeting, but I am going to come back, and if you want to wait... They
know
okay.
in the weeds of that, but I'll only say one thing.
Okay.
And that I think our government has to call to account both those who are friends and those who are not, with whom we are not so friendly, when they begin to play with history. It's a steady slope downwards. They're playing with history and saying, we weren't responsible, we didn't, whatever it might be. It's dangerous. But about the specifics of the different governments, I think the next panel is much better equipped.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Keating, let me yield back. I'm going to step out for a quick meeting, then I'm going to come back in the panel. Where's the next panel? You heard my question. Be thinking about it. Thank you. I'll be right back.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank our witnesses. I just, you know, your testimony had the effect. I've been through many hearings. Seldom have I heard my colleagues open up, share so much of themselves, their stories, as I have today. And I think that's because of your testimony and your presence here. It's deeply appreciated. It's very important. Thank you for being here. And we'll all work on this together, not just in Europe, but in our own country, in our own neighborhoods, in our own schools, and at our own dinner tables.
Thank you.
Thank you both. As our first panel leaves, if we could assemble our second panel, and we'll have people coming in and going. We had a special member briefing on the coronavirus in the midst of this, so you'll see people coming in and coming out, but we'll take a few moments to recess and assemble the second panel. I'd like to reconvene and introduce our second panel. Mr. Ira Foreman is a senior advisor of combating anti-Semitism at the Human Rights First and an adjunct professor on anti-Semitism with the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University. Thank you for being here. Ms. Christy Edwards is the acting head of the Department on Tolerance and Non-Discrimination in the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you so much for being here as well. Dr. Robert Williams is the Deputy Director of International Affairs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We've heard a great deal with the first panel about the museum. I think, as most members of Congress have been there, it is one of the most moving experiences people will have in their life. Rabbi Andrew Baker is Director of International Jewish Affairs at the American Jewish Committee, as well as the personal representative of the chairperson in office on combating anti-Semitism at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate your time. I think there were questions raised. A lot of the first questioning for the first panel was unique for hearings. I think there was a lot of people sharing their own experiences, but many of the questions they have as their time ran out could be appropriately addressed with you as a panel, and I'm looking forward to that. I'll go with Mr. Foreman for your statement. Thank you very much. We'll set a time as we do the first of 5 minutes for the opening statements. Anything else with written statements can be for the record. Mr. Foreman.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to appear today. I'm especially appreciative that the subcommittee is holding this hearing. Shining this type of congressional spotlight on the problems is exactly what international political actors who dabble in anti-Semitism fear the most. I would hazard a guess that no one on these two panels would disagree with the statement that anti-Semitism has increased worldwide in recent years. There's lots of data to prove this. Moreover, if one talks to Jewish community leaders in any European country, you'll get the same answer. Of course, in the U.S., we can't ignore the spike in violence, anti-Semitic violence, in the last few months. It's a wake-up call for the American Jewish community and for the United States. Yet, for all of our problems here, the smaller Jewish communities in Europe, I believe, face much more immediate and existential threats from anti-Semitism. To effectively fight anti-Semitism, we must first understand its nature and where in society it is located. This is no simple task. Today's anti-Semitism takes multiple forms and mutates. In my written testimony, I cite 3 European countries, Hungary, France, the UK, as examples of different forms of anti-Semitism, going from the extreme right to the extreme left. In my remarks today, I'd like to focus briefly on anti-Semitism in Hungary. Anti-Semitism in Hungary is a far-right nationalist phenomenon, xenophobic. Prime Minister Orban has said on numerous occasions that Hungary has zero tolerance from anti-Semitism, and he has strengthened the relationship with Israel's government. Yet, Jewish community leaders are deeply concerned about a number of government activities. The first set of actions are what have to do with historical memory, the unwillingness to truthfully deal with historical Hungarian anti-Semitism, especially during the Holocaust. First example is a Holocaust museum they're developing called the House of Fates. And yet, inexplicably, they insist on naming a well-known Holocaust distorter to develop the museum's program. They also, over the past few years, have honored numerous figures, political and even literary, from the World War II era that are deeply anti-Semitic and responsible for Jewish deaths. The second set of problems are what I call dog whistle anti-Semitism. Prime Minister Orban's party has employed subtle but clear Nazi-era anti-Semitic memes, the laughing Jew, the Nazi meme of the Jewish puppet master. And in fact, an Orban speech in the parliamentary elections in 2018 was so rife with vile, classic anti-Semitic language that a National Review writer who had been sympathetic to the Fidesz government said it reads like something right out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. So what do? Clearly, there are no silver bullets. We have to be doing multiple things. If you talk to experts, they talk about the importance for security for Jewish communities, but also of other endangered communities. We have to deal with hate crime data, and I'm sure our OSCE representative will talk more about this, collect it better. We talked about education. Education will be crucial, and social media, and dealing with social media. But one thing I want to mention here that we can't do, and that is let anti-Semitism become just another partisan wedge issue. If we do, we will lose this battle. We need bipartisanship on this issue. I recommend a number of things in my testimony. I just want to mention that I want to ask you to urge your Senate colleagues to pass legislation similar to H.R. 221, which raises the status of the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism at the State Department to the ambassadorial level. Doing that, as well as making sure the office has enough resources, is critical at this time. In conclusion, I'd like to paraphrase the comments of one French leader I met when I visited at the State Department, who told me in the aftermath of violent incidents that hit his community, he said, "This is not ultimately about us. It's not about the Jews. The Jewish community may be the first group that faces this type of hate, but we will not be the last. This is about the very values of the French Republic, the very values that sustain democracy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Edwards.
Chairman Keating, distinguished members, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. I'm coming from the Warsaw-based Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And my office provides support, assistance, and expertise to participating states and to civil society, promoting democracy, rule of law, human rights, and tolerance and non-discrimination. OSCE participating states recognize that manifestations of discrimination and intolerance, such as anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and hate crimes, threaten the security of individuals, communities, and societies, and may give rise to wider-scale conflict and violence that undermine international stability and security. For this reason, OSCE participating states strongly condemn racial and ethnic hatred, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and discrimination, as well as persecution on religious or belief grounds, and have committed to combat these phenomena in all of their forms. The past few years have evidenced a trend away from a global culture of the respect for human rights. Anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia continue to be an issue of concern across the OSCE region. Some minority communities, including people of African descent, Roma and Sinti, and persons with a migrant background, including refugees and asylum seekers, are disproportionately affected and targeted by security policies that include racial and ethnic profiling. Additionally, numerous hate crimes against these communities and other minority communities can be seen across the OSCE region, as contributions to the ODIHR annual hate crime report show. While this has resulted in a broader and more visible dialogue on the existence and impact of hate crimes throughout the OSCE region, it also threatens to reorient the focus of ODIHR's work from proactive to reactive. Occupying the vast area and fulfilling human rights left open by government, civil society has globally been put on the defensive in this work. The OSCE region has unfortunately not been spared this challenge, as groups active in the promotion of tolerance and non-discrimination and the identification of hate crimes are often branded as agitators and accused of destabilizing communities and societies. The subsequent withdrawal of many groups from the regional discourse has resulted in a lack of transparency and given license to the persecution of vulnerable groups. Additionally, human rights defenders from civil society addressing anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia are often themselves the victims of hate crime, often by association. In some participating states, they also report that the rise in intolerance leads to an increasing hostile environment for their work, cuts in government funding, and other ways of impeding their work. There is also a trend of merging anti-migrant feelings with feelings of racism, directed at a range of minority groups, accompanied by the intersectional nature of many hate crimes. We also note that the increasingly technically sophisticated tools are needed to understand, analyze, and help combat hate crimes, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. So to address this, ODIHR has developed a collection of resources and programs to raise awareness about discrimination, hate crimes, anti-Semitism, and other forms of intolerance. Through advising on policy and training of law enforcement personnel and educators, ODIHR works to build the capacities of governments in preventing and responding to this problem. And in my written testimony, I note a couple of different programs that we have for civil society, which I'm happy to address further. There is a need to tap further into the potential of dialogue between governments, faith groups, and civil society, and in this light, ODIHR has convened a number of international events and trainings to address intolerance and discrimination. In all of these activities, ODIHR takes a comprehensive approach and brings stakeholders from different sectors and different communities to work together on a wide range of tolerance and non-discrimination issues. OSCE participating states have committed to take steps to prevent and address intolerance and discrimination while applying a common approach to address all acts and manifestations of hate, while acknowledging the uniqueness of the manifestations and the historical background of each form. Different types of intolerance have their own unambiguous etymologies and rationale, yet in order to address the underlying biases and othering that underpins many forms of discrimination, we need to be aware of their similarities, their interconnected developments, and their constant intersection. At ODIHR, in line with the comprehensive nature of our work, we also believe in the power of building coalitions to address intolerance and discrimination, and we've built a set of tools for civil society and communities willing to engage together. ODIHR remains at the disposal of OSCE participating states, civil society, and other actors in supporting the implementation of their commitments to counter intolerance and discrimination. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. Dr. Williams?
Thank you, Chairman Keating and members of the subcommittee, not only for convening this discussion, but for your leadership on this crucial issue. It's my great honor to speak on behalf of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. At the museum, we inspire citizens and leaders in the United States and abroad to confront hatred, to prevent genocide, and to promote human dignity through active engagement with the Holocaust. Now, why the Holocaust? We focus on the Holocaust because it was an unprecedented catastrophe, because it involved multiple societies and cultures and did not respect any borders, and because its scale was so vast that we had to invent new international systems to cope with the damage. The Holocaust resonates, in part because it warns us that the unthinkable is always possible, that all of us must rise above our potential to abuse privilege, and that we cannot remain on the sidelines when we encounter hatred. With the passing of the generation of Holocaust survivors, it's both more difficult and more necessary to counter anti-Semitism and hate in all of their forms. Now, in addition to working at the museum, I am the chairman of the Anti-Semitism Committee at the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a 34-nation body of diplomats and experts who gather to deal with these issues. And I can tell you that today, one of the more increasingly common manifestations of anti-Semitism is distortion, less so denial, of the Holocaust. This is something that spreads from the Russian Federation all the way to Ireland and from Finland to Italy. No country is immune. Now, there are many reasons for this, but one, to borrow from H.G. Wells, is our collective ongoing race between education and catastrophe. Unfortunately, catastrophe seems to be leading the way. Decades of investment in scholarship, secondary education, Holocaust survivor testimonies, and commemoration built awareness of the Holocaust, but more is needed. For example, a recent study found that in France, 57% of adults do not know that 6 million Jews died during the course of the Holocaust. 45% of French millennials are unaware that the French government under Pétain collaborated with the Nazis. Similarly disheartening results can be found elsewhere. Clearly, Holocaust education needs reinforcement over both the long and the short term, and it needs to be extended to new audiences. To do so, we Americans should work with our European allies and with intergovernmental bodies in order to first expand and strengthen the infrastructure of European institutions that can provide authoritative information on the Holocaust and help counter anti-Semitism and extremism. Consider my home institution, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. With consistent support by the U.S. Congress since 1993, my institution has hosted more than 45 million people on site at our museum here in Washington. More than that, close to 20 million people from 238 countries and territories each year accessing our online resources. Imagine if there were similar institutions in the lands where the Holocaust occurred. Second, we must work with our European allies to ensure that funds do not go to organizations that promote anti-Semitism, Holocaust distortion, or other forms of hate. It's surprising, but it happens more often than you may think, and I have a few examples in my written testimony. Third, we must develop sustainable training programs for public servants that communicate the relevance of the Holocaust to their work. These programs should target civil servants, law enforcement, military leaders, legislators, and other government professionals. They might highlight the failures of their predecessors to not stand up against encroaching fascism, or instruct on the warning signs that threaten our core transatlantic values, or teach how to counter resurgent anti-Semitism and bias. There's no more American ethic than taking on the responsibility to do more, and doing more in this arena can help us continue to build a future that can avoid the calamities of the past and ensure that the Holocaust resonates for future generations. But if we don't act now, if we don't educate better, if we don't train more audiences, and if we do not equip ourselves to resist anti-Semitism and extremism, we will have failed the victims, we will fail the survivors, and we will have failed one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Rabbi Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to address you and the committee. I've served for almost 30 years in my AJC role working with Jewish communities in Europe, and in the last 12 years with the OSCE as a special envoy on combating anti-Semitism, which has allowed me to bring up this issue in about 30 of those countries. So let me suggest a kind of quick basic framework with which to look at the problem and identify the concerns and try and mobilize for action. The more complete information you'll find in my written testimony. I would say what we want to do quite simply is define the problem, recognize the sources of where the problem is emerging in Europe, and mobilize. How do we mobilize governments and others to deal with the problem? The issue of definition ought to be apparent by now. Anti-Semitism presents itself in various forms. It's prejudice, it's discrimination, but it's also conspiracy theories. It's Holocaust denial. It is also anti-Semitism as it relates to Israel, when the state of Israel itself is demonized. It's important that societies understand it, police, prosecutors, judges, monitors, recognize this multi-nature that anti-Semitism is. We need to be able to recognize the different sources, the places from which anti-Semitism is coming today. I would suggest there are 5 areas to at least look at and identify. We see anti-Semitism from the right, understood, often traditional, anti-Semitism from extremist neo-Nazi groups, the growth of right-wing extremist parties, where anti-Semitism is a part of their agenda. We see anti-Semitism on the left, a kind of anti-Semitism folded into left-wing movements and parties. The most notable, most evident had been Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party in the UK, often an anti-Semitism which is thinly disguised as a kind of anti-Zionism, that anti-Israel animus coming forward. We see anti-Semitism coming in different countries in Europe from parts of the Muslim and Arab communities. Here, it may be generated by antagonism from conflicts in the Middle East and may be a kind of imported anti-Semitism from those countries, but it has probably been the source in Western Europe of most incidents of anti-Semitism that Jews themselves have identified. Finally, we need to see that there are other aspects of anti-Semitism, not so much along a political spectrum, but have their own impact, particularly, say, in countries of Central and Eastern Europe, places where the Holocaust occurred, countries that did not really come to terms with their own history of participation, of collaboration. They couldn't do this until the fall of communism. And what we saw was a kind of revival of their fascist-era heroes and figures. The idea that somehow these people could be honored despite the role they played in the Holocaust is a terrible example of what we see in various places, but its significance to the safety and security, the physical and emotional comfort of Jews who themselves are largely communities of survivors and their heirs ought to be evident. We see efforts in a number of Northern European countries to address, to ban or restrict traditional religious practices, in particular religious slaughter, kashrut, and ritual circumcision, brit milah. These may not be anti-Semitic by design, by intent, but they ultimately are by effect, meaning Jewish communities cannot observe and conduct ritual practices, parts of their religious life that has been with them for centuries. Those are areas where we see these problems. The question now is, what do we do? How do we mobilize governments? What can they do? The issues are clear. Security first and foremost. Addressing anti-Semitism by understanding it. Adopt that working definition of anti-Semitism so the society has a complete picture. Education, we've heard much about education dealing with the Holocaust, but that education also ought to include the long histories of Jewish life in these countries. To understand Jews were contributors to those societies, not only victims in the Holocaust that followed. These elements, I think, all put together can give us a picture of the problems we face and the goals, the efforts that we ought to be asking our European partners to undertake. Thank you.
Thank all of you. A couple of points as I went through. The consistent thread was the issue of security, law enforcement, training. Before I was in Congress, I was a district attorney, having our own office, and we had programs on training prosecutors, educating prosecutors, training them, and police, including not only the police attached to us at our office, but local police forces. And when we had these programs, not only were the police willing participants, but they were enthusiastic, given the chance to get involved in this. But there were funding issues, and also, I think, important for today's hearing, the fact that somehow the pressing issues of the day and the week and the budgetary issues, this well-intended effort probably on some of the forces would keep getting pushed aside by the leadership. So I think one of the lessons of today is the importance of that. We can make all the laws we want. If they're not interpreted, if they're not recognized when they're in violation, or they're not enforced, those laws become meaningless. So that's an important thread I heard. I'm glad these programs are being done outside the country as well. And if we can find ways to support that and let us know, certainly come to us as a committee. The other thing is, it's a little different politically in Europe and in the U.S. in this respect. They're parliamentary in nature, and there's multiple parties and coalitions. And the difference between those parties as they try and become larger or build coalitions, not the kind of coalitions we were talking about necessarily here, but there's a different political landscape there with these coalitions. And I recall trips that we took as members of Congress where we raised issues with specific political parties within those countries saying, you know, you're gathering together, you're combining with these other groups that are clearly hate groups. We called them out on it as, you know, part of the U.S. But can you just enlighten us a little bit with your experience internationally? I mean, that's a difference. And there's more pressure with these coalitions that are built to have small minority people have greater influence because that could push them over the top with the coalition. Ms. Edwards, I know you're anxious to address that.
Thank you, yes. Well, of course, as many of you might know, some of the flagship programs that ODIHR has been offering for many years now are training on hate crimes for police and for prosecutors. And so that's one of the major efforts that we do make with governments across the OSCE region, and that's been a highly successful and well-implemented series of programs, and we're actually very grateful for the United States and their recent contribution to that work. So I would definitely agree with your statement that this is something that we found to be very effective, but also something that many police forces and prosecutors are very enthusiastic about. It's certainly helpful in their work. To your point regarding coalition building, this is an issue that we address more regularly with members of civil society rather than political parties. And I think it could go both ways. I think that obviously the tools that we have for civil societies who are building coalitions are to build coalitions specifically addressing intolerance and non-discrimination. Intolerance and discrimination. So we're encouraging them to join with groups that might be completely different than their own perspective, whether it's a Jewish community, Muslim community, LGBTI, people of African descent, refugees, migrants, et cetera. We encourage all of them to come together because there are so many issues and areas where they do have things in common, where they do face similar challenges, and where they can support, as Representative Meeks said, you know, he wants the Jewish community to stand up against racism as well as...
What if we could, about the issue of these political coalitions, because we see that all the time, even in the most democratic of countries. Yeah. We see political coalitions within parties coming together so they have enough for the majority, and they seem to be embracing frankly, other groups, political parties that are, some of them racist, clearly racist. I mean, we do see it. Is there any comment that, I know, Mr. Foreman, you touched upon it. That's what got me to thinking about this question.
So in the parliamentary situation, one of the things I was struck with when I was at the State Department was the influence of the United States on our European allies. And I talk often with my students about where our influence is greatest. A lot of times, we have allies in Europe who are doing things on anti-Semitism, which we think they're trying their best. They have, and the problems are largely civil society. We have actually more influence when the government is part of the problem. Countries often in Eastern Europe, where they want U.S. support. I think you touched on it, Mr. Chairman, that the administration, any administration, needs to speak out on some of these things. When we have neo-Nazis being possibilities in coalitions, it is essentially we're embarrassing, we're shaming people. And I think on some levels, members of Congress also have that ability. These hearings like this, hearings on specific countries, have that power. And the other thing is, there is an organization of parliamentarians against anti-Semitism. It's not been very active, but U.S. members of Congress could take a more leading role in that organization and encourage parliamentarians to push on whether issues like this or other issues we think they could be doing better on.
Great. Since my time is up, I'll recognize Representative Pence, but I think for the other members of the panel, you'll have an opportunity, I think, to address those kind of issues with the other questions. Representative Pence.
Thank you again, Chairman Keating and Ranking Member McCall, for having this hearing, and thank you all for being here. I think you heard that I'm in the family business on anti-Semitism earlier, and it's education, education, education. I'd like to start by highlighting my home state for its work to educate the next generation Hoosiers about the Holocaust. Indiana is currently one of only 12 states that requires Holocaust education as part of state curriculum. I'd like to commend Governor Holcomb, who declared January 27th to be EVA Education Day in honor of Auschwitz survivor and Hoosier Eva Kor. To all the witnesses, thank you for your time. I appreciate you sharing your experience. Rabbi Baker, I think you put it wonderfully and simply in your testimony, quote, education matters, and all of you, actually, everyone today mentioned the education. I could not agree more. This point is an important theme in all the testimony we have heard today. Education, education, education. This morning, I had a long conversation with Department of State Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, Ilan Carr. Special Envoy Carr highlighted that we know the three distinct sources of anti-Semitism, which was mentioned repeatedly today: far-right neo-Nazism, radical left, anti-Israelism, if you will, and militant Islam. To talk about only one source is to not take the problem seriously. Mr. Carr's most important message to me, one that I think is worth emphasizing in this chamber, is that it is important to fight all of it, all anti-Semitism, wherever it rears its ugly head. Like many of the witnesses, Special Envoy Carr emphasized the importance of education combating the spiritual sickness that is anti-Semitism. I'm grateful for Special Envoy Carr's time and very proud of the work he and his team are doing to ensure the United States is leading voice combating anti-Semitism around the world. We are truly blessed with amazing professionals dedicated to this important mission, like those of you at the table here. America is and must remain the leading voice in combating anti-Semitism around the world, and while we must call out both our partners and non-partners alike who fall short of the mark in addressing anti-Semitism and hate, I sincerely hope and appreciate that this conversation also includes scaling up our efforts to work alongside like-minded nations towards our common goals. I do not have a question for the witnesses today. I simply want to say that I am grateful to you, Chairman Keating, for convening such an important hearing. I am thankful to all the witnesses for briefing the committee. Finally, I would like to close by saying that myself and my entire family have always been and always will be committed to pushing back against hate in all of its forms. And this week in particular, I am proud of my home state and the work of the U.S. government to combat the evil of anti-Semitism at home and abroad. I am proud that this subcommittee has devoted time to this important issue, as there's always room to do better. I look forward to working with everyone in this room to continue to combat anti-Semitism. Mr. Chair, thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative. Vice Chair Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin by asking questions on behalf of my colleague, Representative Frankel, who had to leave to another meeting, but she was kind enough to task me with her questions. Her first question is, can you assess overall what European governments' responses are to rising anti-Semitism and how effective they are? And the second piece of her question, which I think might direct some of your answers, are European governments coordinating on data sharing and hate crime sharing across borders? And do you see this being effectively addressed at the EU level? And I'll open it up to whoever would like to speak to these questions.
So perhaps to start, and then I'll hand it over to my colleagues, because we're all engaged in this together, overlapping at times. Concerning European government responses, it won't surprise you to know that those responses are inconsistent across borders. It depends on the state, and it depends on how seriously they view anti-Semitism as a domestic issue as opposed to an issue that they like to displace on other countries. There is a tendency in some European countries to say that anti-Semitism is a problem only of France. We don't have anti-Semitism here because we don't have a Muslim population, for example. This form of displacement is increasingly common in certain Central European countries. There are other times where anti-Semitism is displaced as a legacy from the Second World War. We are seeing this rhetoric more often than not emerging from the Russian Federation vis-a-vis Baltic member countries or Poland. So there is no single formula. Now, there are convening bodies, of which the OSCE is one. I'll let the OSCE ODIHR speak for itself. The other would be the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights, where there are attempts to collect data and to issue recommendations on how to deal with anti-Semitism. But as the so-called FRA notes in its most recent report, which came out at the end of last year, inadequate reporting of hate crime incidents, in particular anti-Semitism, makes their work exceedingly difficult. Added to this, there is a report also done by the Fundamental Rights Agency that notes that 79% of Jews in at least 12 EU member countries do not report hate crime incidents when they happen. This is because they believe that even if they told the police, nothing would happen as a result. So there are problems to be solved. I think there is also a demand for American leadership and American expertise. I see Representative Pence. I wanted to mention something specific to Indiana, which is hard for a boy who grew up in Kentucky. But IU in particular has a model that may be worth exporting abroad. IU is one of the only universities in the world that has an academic center focused on the study of anti-Semitism. And more than that, IU has been one of the central universities in the United States teaching the essential foreign language skills needed to confront anti-Semitism today. Those foreign languages in particular include Russian and Ukrainian. Thank you.
If I could follow, I think one of the real challenges and questions if you compare countries is really what is the political will to deal with these problems. In some of these countries, I would say the first problem is the question of physical security. And it took some years for governments really to step forward. In a way, they may not be coordinated, but hopefully one can look from what one country is doing to try to press or encourage another country to follow suit. I think there was not, we go back not that many years, 2012, 2013, serious attacks, but little effort on the part of governments to really realize the threats facing Jewish communities, let alone doing something. More and more, they're doing something now. They're providing funding, they're trying to coordinate with their own police and so on. There have been tragic events where they were simply not there when they should have been. And so I think that is one area where there is growing recognition and action on the part of governments. At the same time, those threats haven't disappeared, and even if buildings themselves are protected, Jews going to and from synagogue or schools, simply going day to day in the streets, are vulnerable. And it may not always be physical attacks, but verbal harassment and the like. So that's something that's present as well. When we talk about education, I think it becomes so important to say, understand that Jews are part of your society. And even as there is a focus on Holocaust education, keep in mind that that often presents a very limited and distorted picture of what Jewish life is or was like. Our own organization had done a number of analysis of textbooks. Where did Jews appear in textbooks? And typically we found they appeared twice. 2,000 years ago to explain the coming of Jesus and Christianity, disappeared, and then they returned in the 1930s and 40s to be victims in the Holocaust. So to try to get a full picture of who they are, particularly in societies where Jews are few, is a challenge. It requires government support, not just in education, but supporting museums and the like. And here, too, I think, examples in one place can help leverage others. The European Union, the European Council has important declarations. It's up to governments to follow through. Similarly, in the OSCE, there are a great number of significant commitments that governments have made in security and education, in police training, in collecting data, but they really need to be pushed and encouraged to live up to those commitments.
Thank you.
Can I answer your question about the data collection? This is actually one of the biggest flagship areas that my office actually works on, and we produce the largest collection of hate crime data in the world every year on November 16th on the International Day of Tolerance. And of course, anti-Semitism is one of the issues that is covered, as well as racism, xenophobia, anti-Muslim bias, LGBT, many, many forms of bias. And this is, of course, reported to us by all of the OSCE governments, or at least most of them, but this is one of the commitments that OSCE countries have made to provide that data to ODIHR every year so that we can publish it. We also publish a significant amount of information given to us by civil society and international organizations as well. But to your question about what can countries be doing better, this is an issue that we spend a lot of time in my department working on. As Rob mentioned, we do a lot of trainings, often in coordination with FRA, to assist participating states in improving their data collection efforts. Because some of the studies that we've done have shown that we know we get about 20% of the actual hate crimes that occur reported to us. So it's a very, very underreported phenomenon, and there are many reasons for this that we can obviously spend a lot more time talking about. But this is a huge effort, again, done by my department to give us better data, and then that helps us in turn provide better assistance to governments. And one of the programs that was actually significantly supported financially by the US government was a project on comprehensive criminal justice approaches to hate crime. And we worked with 4 countries looking at different ways where criminal justice agencies in 4 different countries could work better to address these issues from a comprehensive nature. So doing joint police and prosecutor trainings, having an interagency approach, having studies on underreported natures of hate crimes, and then at the end of that program, we brought all of these countries together so that they could learn from each other in the things that they'd gone through. And now that is being expanded. And again, the US has given us a contribution to help expand that work into countries beyond those 4 initial countries. So there's so much more that can be done. We're certainly so grateful for the support of the US government in doing this. But certainly a lot of room to grow in this area as well.
Vice Chair Spanberger, my experience from 2013 to 17 at the State Department was there is a whole range of government reactions. In general, I would tell you that our major allies, such as UK, France, and Germany, I think at least at the federal level, there is a real understanding not only that they have to protect their Jewish communities, but this is an existential threat to their democratic ways. I think you hear that, and it actually even, for example, in France, when you went from a socialist government to the Macron government, that kind of attitude stayed, generally at the top, at least. And I think that oftentimes we will see, for example, in a place like Germany, they want to do the right things. They often don't have the answers. When they have such large immigrant populations from countries where anti-Semitism attitudes are very high, they know that's a problem. They know 10 years down the road it could be a huge problem, and they're trying to think about how do they solve that problem. They don't know. And frankly, I don't think we know either, but some collaboration would be helpful. Once you get past those countries, there's a change. There's a range of attitudes. There's apathy. There is ambivalence in some countries in terms of how important this issue. And in some countries, frankly, anti-Semitism is used as a political tool. It can be used in election campaigns by using anti-Semitism. Sometimes it is, oh, look at how well we treat our Jewish communities. So there is a real range, and frankly, things could change. For example, UK governments, both Labour governments earlier and conservative governments, have been very responsive and worked very closely with Jewish organizations like this Community Security Trust on security. They've been great. But if we had a change in governments, we had a Labour government now, this would change dramatically. We'd have real problems at the top at the UK. So this is a whole range and a panoply. And I think as we look as a U.S. government on how we address these issues, it's not simple. There's no cookie-cutter approach. We have to go country by country, and the bilateral relationship to the United States and those countries is critical. And again, political leadership starts it, but it's not, and our political leadership working with them, sometimes in private diplomacy, sometimes in public diplomacy.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Well, thank you. Just a final comment, and you could react to this if you want, but you brought up the issue, and it's a challenge generationally. You know, one of the things that I've discussed with my counterparts in the European Union and other European countries was the fact that the lack of understanding of the historical coalition that we had, why NATO was based, why it was formed, because the generation before, at least me, they were participants. It was part of their real life. It occurred. They lived it. But the subsequent generations, they really don't quite understand that because they haven't lived it. And we talked about, in terms of issues of security, how we have to work together on both sides of the Atlantic to make sure the next generation understands better and the generation after that, because that's a real challenge. And, you know, when I was looking at the comment I think Dr. Williams made about, you know, denial is less used than distortion now. And if you haven't lived it and you don't have that experience, it's that much harder to just educate and make people aware of it. And that's another challenge. You know, I was in, several years ago when I was in Berlin, I was walking around and I was absolutely stunned because I looked around and there was a huge set of murals of Adolf Hitler in his Nazi uniform, all with his chief of staff and all the names we recognize so well, the leading Nazis that worked with him. And I said, what is that doing there? And I looked over, and in the murals was a historical explanation of what happened right out there in the public, so you couldn't miss it. And then across the street, some of you might know that, across the street was a park of stones, and each of those stones represented victims in the Holocaust. And there it was. You couldn't miss it. Now, that's not going to solve all the problems, but it's the kind of thing that's important because it's helping those other generations understand that something happened. And importantly, that these things were real. Hitler was real to my parents and that generation. They knew his evilness. They knew it existed in the world. It's so much harder transcending generations because he's some kind of character. that's out there. And that's, when they have that kind of lack of real-time experience, it's easy to distort the way that they're doing that, whether it's on social media or not. So that's part of our challenge, whether it's done. But we have to acknowledge what happened. And we have to realize, those of us that are touched with the generation that went to war and closer to it, that, or lost an uncle, as I did in World War II. I mean, those things are real. Now, the Holocaust Museum does a terrific job of making it real, but we have to find ways throughout all our communities and in other countries, the fact that this existed, evil exists, it exists today, and we have to challenge it and acknowledge it. So if you want to end with a closing statement on those things, and then I'll give a second round before I give my closing statement to the Vice Chair once more. Maybe I'll do this. I'll have the Vice Chair, the day has been long, I'll give the Vice Chair a chance to ask, and you can address all of those issues. Back to the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so grateful for all of the time that you've spent with us. We've talked a lot about the need for education. Our first panel mentioned it. You all have mentioned it. And we've talked a lot about what happened in the Holocaust, the magnitude of the Holocaust. And I think Dr. Lipstadt made an interesting point when she said the Holocaust couldn't have happened without hundreds of thousands of helpers, people who either helped through aggressive action or people who helped by their silence. And we also see that throughout history there are ebbs and flows, and the data show that, in fact, right now we are seeing an uptick in Europe, in the United States, in anti-Semitic violence and rhetoric. And so my question is, in addition to educating ourselves on what happened, I would love your comments, having read a fair amount about this just on a personal level, about what is wrong right now? What are we doing? What are some of the weaknesses in our society, be it economic, be it social, that is allowing for this sickness to take hold in a way that it hasn't as deeply in recent past? And we see trends of what happened before Nazi Germany took hold. And I'd love for you to comment, social, economic, political, what are the weaknesses, and how can we educate ourselves to inoculate ourselves against those weaknesses so that we can root out this sickness aggressively and ensure that, in fact, it is a never again reality that we all live. And I'll open the question to anyone who wants to answer.
So maybe I'll start. It's a very complicated question. I won't try to characterize the rise of populist governments in Europe in a few statements. But we are in a state, akin to what Professor Lipstadt said, where the guardrails have come off to a certain extent. There have been significant changes to the way that we educate, not just on the other side of the Atlantic, but closer to home as well. We often think of education in economic terms. There's a logic to this, of course. But it's not certain that our new modes of educating are promoting or creating the citizenry that we aspired to in the immediate post-war era. Are we teaching enough ethics? Are we teaching enough civics? There's no easy answer there. Part of it's also the breadth of what we educate. As Rabbi Baker noted, oftentimes when we talk about education about the Jewish experience, we get Israel 2,000 years ago, and then we get the Holocaust. We don't get the ways by which Jews have contributed to our societies and our cultures. So we're seeing not just Jews, but other subaltern groups, to use a very academic term, only in snippets. There's also, if I may, a tendency 75 years after an event for history to become subject to what some are calling denialism, some are calling the post-factual reality. This did not just happen in the case of the Holocaust, this happened in the case of the French Revolution. You need people to carry forth that history, especially when you're dealing with an event like the Holocaust, which was a civilizational break akin to the French Revolution, akin to our own revolution, that reshaped society. And if we reinsert these events in a way that have real meaning, like our revolution has meaning for our students today, perhaps then we will return to a more proper path.
I'd like to say that I don't want to be a pessimist here, But I think we have to recognize that we're not in the business of ending anti-Semitism. As been alluded here, it's been around at least 2,000 years. We can count on it's going to be around for centuries to come. We can't eliminate it, but we can turn down, I like to use the metaphor of a faucet. We can't turn the faucet off, we can turn it down. But even that is difficult because it takes multiple strategies. And we've talked about some security strategies. We've talked, and there's all kinds of things to talk about in security, but frankly, security, as essential as it is, does relatively little to tone down anti-Semitism. Perhaps prosecution will give some, strong prosecution will deter some violence, but by and large, it's absolutely essential, but it's more like a Band-Aid than a cure. We talked a lot about education, and I'd like to address the chairman's talk about what education works. But frankly, and we talk about political leadership, which I think is essential, starting at the top, but going down all the way to the local level. But one thing we don't talk a lot about, and it's not a magic bullet, it's not a silver bullet, it's not a magic wand, but an important piece, and that's civil society. We're not going to do this with just governments. We're not going to just do this with the Jewish community. We need to mobilize civil society. How do we do that? Well, 25 years ago in Billings, Montana, probably a white nationalist threw a cinder block through the window of a Jewish home where there was a Hanukkah menorah. Very few Jews in Billings, maybe 150. And there was a spontaneous reaction in civil society. Religious leaders, all kinds of different denominations of Christian leaders. There were the local political electeds. There were civic leaders, there were business leaders, and the newspaper. That they had menorah marches. People that the paper published a menorah that they put in their windows. That message was to the white nationalists, you are not part of our society. We're going to ostracize you, and we're going to support the victims. Now, that has to be done for anti-Semitism, but other forms of bigotry, too. How do we generate that at a local level? How do we have probably the strongest civil society in the world, and yet, perhaps there are some signs it's weakening. But and it does happen in Europe as well. There was in Italy just the other day, a concentration camp survivor's home. She died a few years ago, her son is there, and there was publicity in the Italian newspapers, and someone wrote, Jews live here, in graffiti on the door. And again, there was a spontaneous march of hundreds of people in that village. We need to learn how to generate local leadership as well as to augment our political leadership. It won't be the silver bullet, but it's an important piece when we put it together with a lot of these other pieces.
I would add that to address your question about some of the root causes here, there's been some fascinating studies about the cognitive bases for why these forms of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism exist. And these studies show that humans are basically hardwired cognitively for an in-group preference, for people who look and speak and believe and think like them. And this can basically be overcome in two ways. One is being self-aware about one's own personal biases, and two, by meaningful connections with people who are different from themselves. And we, of course, at ODIHR highlight that this is a huge way in which intolerance and non-discrimination can be overcome is through coalition building, civil society, as Mr. Foreman mentioned, bringing people from different backgrounds together to all come together and say, hatred has no place here. We do not accept any form of racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, et cetera. And I think the other key issue that we're working on in my office around educational issues, because it does start with young people, we have to make sure that young people have the tools and resources and that teachers have the tools and resources to address this in the classroom. And so we've spent the last few years working on educational policy guidelines around anti-Semitism, creating teacher tools and educational guides on various different forms of anti-Semitism, the history, what does this look like when statements are made, and giving very clear step-by-step guidelines to teachers on how to address it very easily, because often they don't have the tools and resources or knowledge on how to address some of these things. We're also creating video guides and framework curricula around anti-Semitism, and we're taking these tools and then expanding them. So we're creating a similar set of tools around intolerance against Muslims, and hoping to do this for other communities as well. So making sure that teachers have these tools, not just at a high level, at the federal or national level, but that teachers in the classrooms in every part of the country have these resources available to them as well.
I yield back. Thank you for the extra question, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Mr. Foreman, about civil engagement. I just want to say that you're on target. And if people are listening, there's so many ways to do it. It can be done through clergy, through faith-based communities, but it can also be done from families. I learned much as a young child from my grandmother, who talked about the discrimination she suffered coming from Europe, where people in the neighborhood banded together to buy the house that they finally scrimped up enough money to save for, and they had a neighborhood meeting, made phone calls. Fortunately, they weren't successful, but someone wanted to build a temple right down the street from where she lived. And the chutzpah of the woman organizing the meeting called up my grandmother to see if she would get involved. And she would say in her Irish brogue, this wouldn't be the same type of meetings you had about me, would it? But she told me the story when I was a young boy. And one way we can civilly engage is families should tell their stories while the generations are there. We had an event I co-sponsored. It was a leap of faith in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And it was an American mosaic. It was just an idea. We threw it out there. We didn't know if it would succeed. We just put in the newspaper and asked people to come together and tell their family stories. We had people come from Europe. So many came from Europe, and their families came in the 30s to escape what was occurring there. It was subject of today, and the Holocaust. And they told remarkable stories of their family. We had people telling stories from parts of Asia and how they came here. We had people whose generationally, they didn't come here voluntarily. Their families came as slaves. And they told stories about lynchings for their grandparents. They told stories about how their parents couldn't get married legally, what happened. So many different stories. So, Mr. Foreman, there's no dearth of opportunity to engage civilly in this, and hopefully we can come from this. And just a final note, this is the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I think we have a special place when we deal with issues of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. I know all of the committees in Congress and all the members of Congress share a real concern and a need to speak up and go forward and be leaders. But the Foreign Affairs Committee, from the seats that you're in, if you could look up to your right and see the portrait that's hanging there on the furthest to the left. That's the portrait that's hung of Tom Lantos. Tom Lantos was the only Holocaust survivor to serve in Congress. And he was the former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And he founded the Human Rights Caucus, which later was transformed into the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. So I'm sure as he's looking down at us now, he'd be very proud of the committee today, of your participation here today, of the thoughtful and moving comments that our two panels have made, as well as the comments of members of the committee. So I thank you for being a part of that today. And with that thought in mind, I'll adjourn.